Episode 9, Technofeudalism and Managerialism. In this video, I want to look at a recent discussion between two old leftists and how it demonstrates a dawning awareness of a situation described by an old conservative 80 years ago. So the recent discussion took place between Yanis Varoufakis and Slavoj Žižek in 2021, where Varoufakis elaborated on his idea of technofeudalism and described why he believes we are no longer living in a neoliberal order of markets. His main point is that capitalism has been replaced or is being replaced by something else, and that something else is not socialism, but what he calls technofeudalism. So in his view, capitalism requires two things: profit to drive it, and markets in which its mechanisms take place, in which it operates. But now profit is being supplied by central bank money, and platforms like Amazon and Facebook have replaced markets, or are replacing markets. Digital platforms are not markets in that an algorithm determines what is available, who can trade, who cannot trade, and so on. Access to the market is controlled and not free. It's not a market. It's closer to a medieval fiefdom, and hence his word technofeudalism. Another sign that we are moving away from a neoliberal order of markets toward technofeudalism is that the promise of individual sovereignty in the liberal system is disappearing. And what we are being reduced to is data, and that data is available to the big tech companies. So he describes you walk around with a phone in your pocket. That phone is sending various data. It's benefiting Google. It's benefiting Google Maps. It's benefiting whoever. Every search you make, the data is being used. That data is being used to sell. People are using platforms to sell themselves. Private spaces are collapsing. His big example is an event that happened in 2020 on August 12th, when the GDP of the United Kingdom fell over 20%. I think over the course of the year, they revealed that it had fallen over 20%, something that had never happened in the history of capitalism. A fall was expected, but it was expected to be closer to 8 or 9%, not 20. And yet, on that same day, the stock exchange went up by 3%. Which makes no sense according to the usual logic of capitalism. But what happened, as he explains, is that when the news came out, people knew that the people who run the banks were also going to be panicking. They would be printing yet more money, and that more money could be used to play in the stock exchange. And so the value of the stock exchange went up, even though the gross domestic product went down tremendously. At the end of the video, Varoufakis makes the interesting observation that his thesis that we no longer live in a neoliberal order of markets is most opposed by or resisted by the left. Leftists, or he says we Marxists, grew up with a dream of bringing down capitalism, and now they don't want to hear that this has already happened, but it was replaced not by socialism. What I find interesting about this video is that it shows a growing awareness on the left of a fact about our current order, which has been known in the online right for something like 10 to 15 years now. They're becoming aware of something which was in fact described in detail 80 years ago by a man named James Burnham in his book, The Managerial Revolution. And actually, Burnham's book provides a better explanation of the phenomena that Varoufakis is experiencing and trying to name technofeudalism than even what contemporary leftists can offer. Burnham himself was an old Trotskyite, so maybe that's appropriate. If you're not familiar with Burnham, you should be, because his description of the social changes that he saw taking place, while still imperfect and inchoate in some ways, it nevertheless offers one of the best lenses through which to view the changes happening to the system we live in now. Burnham's theory is that capitalism is being replaced not by socialism, but by what he calls managerialism. meaning that a new ruling class is emerging in the developed world, and that ruling class is not capitalists and is not ruling in the interest of capitalists. Instead, the new ruling class is the class of people he calls the managers. To explain what a manager is in Burnham's sense, think of a business that produces a product like an automobile. Modern industry is extremely complex and has many moving parts. There are resources, raw materials, finished goods, factories, workers, supply lines, timing. If you assembled all the engineers and assembly line workers needed to make a car, even together they still would not be able to produce a modern product like a car. To produce such a product, you need someone who is able to source the materials, have them shipped and delivered to the proper place at the proper time, in the proper amounts, and arrange for people to assemble the materials in the proper way, consistently and efficiently, and to deliver the product to market. The people who are responsible for coordinating and directing all that human activity, that is who Burnham calls the managers. And he argues that for all intents and purposes, it is they who control the means of production, because without them, there is no product. They are absolutely necessary to production. Put another way, the CEO of Disney, the managers at Disney, are far more influential over what Disney is and how it operates than any stockholders or even finance capitalists are. In business, this class of person, the managerial class, have names like production manager, operating executive, superintendent, and so on. Their equivalents in government have names like administrator, commissioner, bureau head, and so on. They are important because the division of labor in the modern economy has been carried out to such a vast extent that the people at the top coordinating all the efforts of those below have become supremely important and necessary to the process, more so even than capital. And in fact, in countries like the Soviet Union in Burnham's time, the process of production can be seen to go on without capital in the traditional sense, but it cannot go on without managers. Burnham's theory is that the people who manage affairs in business and in politics constitute a class because they all share the same essential functions in whatever system they're in, and they have a collective interest in things being run the same way. And his second point is that they are increasingly becoming more important vis-a-vis the real economy and real politics than capitalists are. As Burnham puts it, the fact today is that the control of the big capitalists, the control based upon capitalist property rights over the instruments of production and their operation is, though still real, growing tenuous, indirect, intermittent. More and more of the time, over more and more phases of the productive process, no capitalist intervention appears. To return to Varoufakis for a second, when the GDP of the UK fell, the people who play on the stock exchange knew that the banks would print more money because all of the people involved in playing in the stock exchange or in printing money at the bank were members of the same class. They were all managers. They knew, and possibly they were even in contact with each other for detailed information. They knew what they would do. They knew what would happen. Burnham observes a few interesting details about this managerial class. One detail is that profit as such is unnecessary to them. It's unnecessary to their function as managers. We can expect this class to be relatively unconcerned with profit as compared to capitalists because their role is determined by their function as managers. It's not determined by turning a profit. This is why, for instance, the formula of get woke, go broke is an irrelevant formula. First, because no one actually does go broke, but second, because they don't care. The people pushing a woke agenda, which we'll return to later, are part of a class of people who do not care about profit as such, and they are the ones who actually do run things. Another interesting detail about the managerial class is that they see things in terms of coordination, integration, efficiency, and planning. People who manage see things in these terms. Traditional capitalists, and also the great mass of humanity, are just in their way. They are problems to be dealt with. And another detail is that in Burnham's time, the countries which had advanced furthest towards managerialism, as he defined it, at that time, those countries were Soviet Russia, Nazi Germany, and Fascist Italy, and they were all totalitarian regimes. Now, all three of those regimes later failed, but the regime which won both World War II and the Cold War, the American regime, was also a managerialist regime, albeit one of a different sort than the others. In fact, the American regime was more closely aligned to traditional capitalism because it retained interest in private property rights. Now, I submit that the recent response of the Canadian government to a protest in that country was an example of a managerial response to a crisis, and that far from being an anomaly, that response is a sign of how managerial regimes will deal with the masses in times to come. What that means is they will use emergency powers to ignore all the traditional protections which individuals and groups of people enjoyed under a liberal world order. And they will do this in order to restore the managerial order. In other words, they will be openly repressive and totalitarian when needed. And when it's needed, that will be determined by themselves. If you want to see an example of the managerial class acting as a class and coordinating their efforts, read the Time magazine article from February 4, 2021, called "The Secret Bipartisan Campaign That Saved the 2020 Election." Now, there are problems with Burnham's theory and with the social organization that he sees coming. And I think we can see these problems coming more fully into view now. One problem is that the managers do not constitute a coherent political class in the same way that capitalists do and did. Capitalists, you could always say, had a shared interest in things that increase profit. But what's the shared interest of managers? There's nothing concrete in the way that more profit is concrete and measurable. Now, managers do tend to be the same kind of person in the way that people who all share a specific skill set, like a managerial skill set, will have similar personalities. But it's hard to identify too many specific things which coordinate them or allow them to coordinate in the way that capitalists can and were coordinated. What we can say is that managers tend to approach problems, including human and political problems, as if they were logistics issues or factory mishaps. In other words, problems are data sets, and if we could just manipulate and coordinate A with B, with C, and so on, the problems will be resolved. But tendencies and similarities do not coherent political classes make. And Burnham suggests that the managers are not merely a political class, but that they constitute the ruling class. They rule us, and we are ruled by them. So, while I believe that he is correct in that we are ruled by persons who tend to be managers in his sense, that is, the people who make critical decisions are either persons of this class, such as Anthony Fauci running the U.S. health response, or they are ruling in the interests of persons of this class, such as Justin Trudeau as Prime Minister of Canada. But their interests are not always easily discernible as a capitalist's interests could be, because what constitutes them as a class is not as concrete as the drive for profit. Another problem, one which is becoming more significant now, is that profit does still seem to be necessary to the system. Burnham is somewhat sanguine about the managerial model being able to dispense with concerns over profit. And Varoufakis seems to think that central banks printing more and more money can obviate the need for profit. But now we have the phenomenon of global inflation, and it is absolutely a matter of serious concern, not just for ruling elites, but for the masses. Can the central banks just print their way out of this? That's doubtful. And can a system be run without concern for profit at all? In the short run, maybe, but that's doubtful too. So while we are currently in a situation that is off the reservation in terms of what would be expected or predicted by capitalism, there could still be a severe reckoning coming. Another issue, though, and one which I think is of great interest today, is that there is no political formula justifying the rule of the managers. There is, to use the word Burnham uses, no ideology of managerialism which justifies them to themselves or to us. As an example, Burnham describes key features of capitalist ideology, and these include the following: a focus on the individual as something complete in himself and with only external relations to others, relations which are managed by the state, which is limited in power to reduce conflict among people. A stress on private initiative as the main force of economic processes and at the root of moral and psychological activities. So, the idea that everyone wants to make a better life for himself and get ahead in this world, the American dream of obtaining a house, a family, a good job, and so on, and the idea that you can attain these things through thrift, hard work, application of skills, individual effort. A system of natural rights adhering to each individual. These rights under liberalism are inalienable. They cannot be taken away, and they guarantee certain things within the system. And they present certain limitations on the state and on other individuals. A metaphysics of progress, whereby mankind is advancing steadily and inevitably towards the goal of some nebulous but earthly paradise. These broad features form part of an ideology which justified capitalism as necessary and essential to these ends, and justified the reign of the liberal order as the best order by which to secure all these things. Now, there may be disputes within liberalism, within capitalism, over distribution, inequality, representation, and so on, but the bedrock ideas were still there and largely agreed upon. Burnham says that all of these features will disappear as a result of the managerial revolution. None of them are necessary to the rule of managers, and they will be discarded. And I believe that in our time, we are seeing these elements being discarded by our ruling class before our eyes. But the problem is, what is the successor ideology? Burnham says, I think correctly, that an ideology has to do two things. It has to justify the rule of the ruling class, and two, it has to be acceptable to the masses. And in my view, we have no successor ideology that succeeds on both points. The old ideology is indeed being swept away, but there's nothing fully ready to replace it. And this is probably a sign of chaotic times ahead as the capitalist order disappears. One example of a possible successor ideology we might call the loosely connected series of beliefs which we know as wokeism. These are beliefs that arose out of postmodern theories in the university, and the managerial class seems to promote them and find them palatable in the form of diversity training, DIE investment, social credit scores, and the like. But it is debatable how much support these have among the masses, so they fail on point 2, but on point 1, they don't really justify the rule of the managers. In fact, it's an ideology that works more as acid than as glue. It's good at tearing down liberalism and structures based on liberalism, but it's not good at constructing new structures. So maybe the managers enjoy promoting woke ideologies because it undermines capitalists, it undermines the old ruling class, it divides the masses and prevents them from uniting against their rule, asking for more more higher wages, for example, prevents them from unionizing, but it's not really going to be the successor ideology, or at any rate, it seems unlikely. Another failed example would be the ideology promoted by the World Economic Forum. Now, this group is essentially promoters of managerialism, and they absolutely do have an ideology which, at the very least, justifies the rule of the managers and provides plans for what to do with their rule and how to solidify it. But their problem is on point two. Their ideology is not palatable to or accepted by the masses. As one managerial type observed recently, elites around the world trust one another more than ever before, and at the same time, elites around the world are despised and distrusted by the masses. And I would suggest that the problem at bottom with the managerial class is that what defines them as a class also precludes them from anything unifying human beings as human. People will fight and die for honor, for country, for family, for God. They will obey a system in the name of honor, country, family, God. But what will they do for the European Union, for the global GDP, for the managerial class? Managers think in terms of abstractions because that is how they operate. But the human heart attaches itself to concretes. Honor, country, family, God sound like abstractions, but all of these can be expressed in emotional experiences, which we've all had, at least with one or more of these, and to which we can refer when these words are used. People like managers who think of human beings in terms of data points to be manipulated are not thinking in a way that people will ever find persuasive or choice-worthy, because it's not human. It's not something the human heart finds acceptable. Now, they may be able to rule because they control power, they direct power, but the nature of their rule will probably be unstable, totalitarian, and brutal, at least without an effective ideology that justifies their rule and is acceptable to the masses. In the last couple of years, we've seen how the managerial state responds to disobedience, to resistance, to criticism, and even to mistakes of its own making. The results so far are not good. A successor ideology that would be successful in overcoming some of these difficulties will also have to make some kind of concessions to humanity that managers as such have no concept of. What this means is that just as when capitalism replaced feudalism, the ideology which supported capitalism was not produced by capitalists, although they may have funded and supported it, so the successor ideology to capitalism is not going to be coming from universities or the World Economic Forum or anything like that either. And without such an ideology, I believe the managers will find their rule fractious and difficult at best. To return to Varoufakis for a moment, I think it's very likely that the future will be more feudal than capitalist in many ways. Feudalism or technofeudalism might actually end up being something closer to the stable system that replaces capitalism. It might even be closer than managerialism as Burnham describes it. A lot could be said about Burnham's book, and it's very much worth checking out. I don't really want to get into issues such as his predictions about the outcome of World War II, which he made in 1941 when he wrote the book, and which are out of date. But those aren't essential to the thesis of his book. So it doesn't really disprove his thesis that he believed Germany would be successful, or that the German or Russian model would maybe be the model that the world would follow rather than the American. That viewpoint is, it doesn't matter, because the viewpoint which did win out is nevertheless managerial in his sense. I think you can say that. But one interesting detail about his book is that George Orwell's 1984 is in many ways a response to the managerial revolution. And in 1984, Orwell presents a world as divided into three mega-states that have constant rivalries and wars among them. And that's something he borrowed directly from a prediction offered by Burnham in his book. He also predicts that a managerial world system will probably be divided into 3 large mega nations. So 1984, in many ways, may be the form in which Burnham's ideas are most familiar to people. I'm just glad that the left is finally catching up in some ways to where the online right arrived 10 years ago. All right, I'll see you in the next video.